walking furrows.
Can't hear anyone.
Good job, you got it. All right, we're just gonna wait a few more minutes here. People are still coming in.
Let's all take ourselves off mute and speak at the same time and see if we can make Zoom explode.
Ah!
Thanks for your input, Doug.
Hey everybody, this is Teresa. I work with Coast Range Forest Watch, and I'm also work with the Kalmiopsis Audubon Society, who is another one of the co-hosts. We are at capacity for this meeting, and so we are also live streaming this onto Facebook. And so if you know anybody who's trying to get in, please pass that along. It's on Cascadia Wildlands Facebook page. We're also sending out an email to all the registrants. And so yeah, I'm force muting everybody if you have forgotten to mute yourself, just to keep all background noise down. Please make sure you keep yourself on mute, and I'm gonna let Dan Pennington take it from here.
All right, thanks, Teresa. Welcome to Julia Jones' presentation on forest hydrology. I'm Dan Pennington, member of Coast Range Forest Watch. Our group is located in Coos and Curry County. We do work to promote healthy forests, watersheds, and the interface between forestry activity and rural communities. A big focus of our work has been in the Elliott State Forest, where we led the Save the Elliott campaign. We continue to work on the Elliott, as well as lead yearly murrelet surveys, as well as plant and mushroom hikes in the Elliott. More recently, our group helped form the Spray Free Coast campaign, which is a broad coalition of folks up and down the coast focused on ending aerial herbicide spraying. We help lead tutorials on showing community members how to use the Ferns notification system. Twice a year, our group sends out notifications to members in our community that are endangered by upcoming spray events. And we've even started helping rural landowners test their water after spray events. And so we have 3 co-hosts for this event, and I'm going to pass it back to Teresa, who will be talking about Kalmiopsis audubon.
Hi everyone. The Kalmiopsis audubon is located down here in Curry County, where we work on protecting fish and wildlife and birds and their habitat in our little corner of the southern Oregon coast here. We have also been a part of the Spray Free Coast campaign, and our work in that has mostly been to help educate people on the different forestry practices that can affect water quality, and also to help our community members find out when those activities might be happening and could affect them or their drinking water. So.
All right, thanks, Teresa. And now I'm going to pass it to Dylan Plummer with Cascadia Wildlands.
Hey everybody, this is Dylan. I'm the grassroots organizer with Cascadia Wildlands. We are a bioregional nonprofit focused on protecting forest ecosystems, fighting against fossil fuel infrastructure, and protecting endangered species. We're really happy to be a part of this event and just trying to support however we can on the technical side, and really admire all of the work that our partners at Coast Range and the Audubon Society are doing. So thanks so much for having us, and we really look forward to hearing the presentation.
All right, thanks, Dylan. So 6 years ago, my partner Misha and I bought a farm out in the Coast Range in rural Coos County, and we live about 10 miles from the headwaters of the North Fork Coquille River. And water was a big source of stress for kind of figuring out how long we could sustain ourselves out here. And when we talked to the previous owner of our property, he told us that after a clear cut, where our spring originates, in the years following, it started to dry up every year, whereas before the clear cut, it had been perennial. And so that really got us on a journey to kind of find out more about forest hydrology. And we asked our neighbors, and the story was the same. We've had at least 3 neighbors that have had lower water in the summertime after clear cuts. So eventually in 2016, we came across a research paper by Timothy Perry and Julia Jones. And here she's to talk about that. So take us away, Julia.
Great. Thank you so much, Dan and Teresa and Dylan, for the invitation. And can everyone hear me okay? Would you nod or let me know, Dan? Yeah, thumbs up?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes, I hope, maybe a little longer. And during my talk, Dan or Dylan or Teresa are going to monitor the chat window. And so I encourage you, as the talk proceeds, to please enter your questions or comments to everyone in the chat window. And then when I'm finished, we'll begin a discussion, and I'm happy to stay as long as you would like to, up to a point. We do have a final time at which point I will probably be not worth talking to. So, but do enter your questions and we'll try to answer them as much as possible in the time we have allowed. So I'm going to share my screen here and oops. I'm going to stop here. So can everyone see the presentation? Dylan, Teresa, I can see your faces. Dan, okay, great. I'm going to go into presenter mode now. And so I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you about this problem. You know, the effects of forests on water have been a topic of interest to people for millennia. And so it's really interesting to have the opportunity to think about what's been learned. I won't go back millennia, but I will be talking about what's been learned in the last 70 years or so of research in Oregon about the effects of forestry on streamflow. To get us started, I thought it would be good for us to look at the landscape that you live in and think about it a little bit from a hydrologic perspective. You know, this mist that creates this beautiful perspective in the landscape is water vapor in the air. And you know that the Coast Range is a wet place. You also know that forestry has been a feature of the landscape. Most of the forests in the Coast Range, like most of the forests in the Pacific Northwest region, were burned by fire 500 years ago, which means it's very hard to find. It's unusual to find a tree that's more than 500 years old. And then in the Coast Range, there was also another episode of fires in the mid to late 1800s associated with the arrival of Europeans and associated logging and human fires, as well as a period of warmer, drier climate. As a result, as this photo shows, much of the Coast Range contains forests that have regenerated since the mid 1800s, although there are patches, especially in stream valleys of forests that are considerably older than that. And water is everywhere. Here it is in the, not only up in the water vapor in the clouds above us, but also nestling in the valleys as valley fog. And the forests are very tightly connected with the hydrologic cycle, both as users of water. The trees use water for growth, and also as emitters of water, which may be intercepted on the canopy, or water that is evapotranspired out into the atmosphere as trees fix carbon. And so the amazing growth of enormous trees that are present in the remaining mature and old forests of the Coast Range remind us of the inextricable connections between the water cycle, the carbon cycle, and biological diversity. And so while I won't speak in my talk specifically about carbon and biodiversity, I want you to remember that they are always there. They're just lurking on the edges of the stage. And so these enormous forests are possible because of the unique hydrologic cycle and a very high amount of rain and moderate temperatures most of the year through most of the Coast Range, and these amazing species like Sitka spruce and Douglas fir, which can grow to very large size. And even in the secondary forests after mid 19th century logging or fires, growth is very rapid in the Coast Range, which has made it a popular location for commercial forestry. And the Coast Range is really highly dissected, we say, very weathered, lots of streams, lots of stream length, lots of clear, cold streams. And those streams are the sources of water for many people, both in the form of surface water and in the form of springs and groundwater. And they are also the habitat for a wide range of salmonids, as I'm sure you all know. So just as the forests support rare and endangered species like the marbled murrelet, the Coast Range is also known for many biologically diverse strains of salmonids. So tonight we're going to try to think about how do forest practices modify the hydrologic cycle. And so let's think about that for a few minutes. First, we have to think about the way in which forests are inextricably connected with the hydrologic cycle. Forests contribute water to the atmosphere through evapotranspiration, and then that water may condense as dew or fog or clouds and be rained down into the forest, and where it may become surface runoff in the form of streams, or it may replenish groundwater. That's a deficiency of this diagram, which is shown on Google Images as a 5th grade diagram. So I thought I could manage it tonight, but it doesn't show groundwater, but so you have to imagine that. But also surface runoff carries sediment, which is an important component of the story in the Coast Range. Another thing, while we're looking at the hydrologic cycle, that I'd like to raise is that we are not only talking about the effects of forest practices, we are talking about the effects of forest practice in a non-stationary environment. That is, our world is changing because of global warming, and in particular in Oregon, what is happening in much of the Pacific Northwest is that we are experiencing increasing summer temperatures and decreasing summer precipitation. So that is increasing the moisture stress on trees for evapotranspiration during what are already warm and dry summers. So how do we learn about these effects of forestry on stream flow? Really, by far the best approach is to watch ecosystems over long periods of time and to try to do it in a somewhat experimental manner. So here is a slide that shows how a paired watershed experiment works. this uses an example from the Andrews Forest in the Cascades. The basic idea of a paired watershed is that you have a reference watershed and a treated watershed, which at the initiation of the experiment have the same kind of forest cover. And in our region, in the Andrews Forest, in this case, these small watersheds at the initiation of the experiment in 1952 had 500-year-old old growth forests, which had had a little bit of fire in the mid 1800s. And so though these watersheds were gauged and they were watched for a period of almost 10 years. And then one of the watersheds, watershed 1, was harvested starting in the early 1960s, and the other watershed was left unharvested. And they were continued to be measured, stream flow, until the present day, even today. And so the treatment effect can be estimated by looking at what was the relationship between the treated and the reference watershed prior to the logging, and then watching how that relationship changes over time as the treated watershed is harvested and then the forest begins to regrow, is replanted or whatever. So experimental forests, which such as the Andrews Experimental Forest or the South Umpqua Experimental Forest, or others in our region and nationally, are important locations which have long-term paired watershed experiments. And there is also a long-term paired watershed experiment in the Coast Range in the Alsea Basin, which I'll talk about a little more in a minute. But the important thing about long-term paired watershed experiments is the long-term data gives the findings a great deal of, we have a great deal of confidence in the findings from long-term studies because we have a large amount of data, usually very high quality, and so we can really see the patterns. The limitations of paired watershed experiments is that they're quite expensive. The maintenance of the stream flow gauges, the imposition of the treatments, and the continued monitoring cost money. And as a result, there have been, and there are only a few such studies in our region. And the ones that we have were initiated in the 1960s or 1970s, and the treatments that were imposed at that time. Nevertheless, there is an overall strength from this collection of paired watershed experiments because, for one thing, the forests that they contain are still representative of much of our landscape, much of our forest landscape today. And when we compare findings among experiments, we are discovering that these experiments are providing consistent results. So let's go back to thinking about how forestry affects the hydrologic cycle. A principal effect of forestry on the hydrologic cycle is through evapotranspiration. Now, evapotranspiration is the emission of water vapor from the stomata of needles and tree leaves when the stomates are open to absorb carbon dioxide to fix carbon. So remember, the water cycle is coupled with a carbon cycle. And when you cut trees, obviously they stop evapotranspiring. So the water that would have gone up and out of the trees instead stays in the soil or runs off. And as a result, when trees are logged, an initial effect is that the soils get wetter and flooding increases. So many studies have shown that an initial effect of the harvest of forests, and in these experiments, they were almost all mature and old growth forest, was a large increase, 50% or more increase in water yield and comparable increases in the height of peak flows. So a peak flow is the highest point that's reached by the water flowing in a stream or river, the flood flow, but peaks can be little flows as well as big flows. And this effect of harvest was apparent not only for little peak flows, but for large floods, ones that occur only once a year or every 10 years or longer. And this effect can persist for 40 years or longer as the sites that were logged that used to be mature and old growth forest are replanted and younger forests regrow. I hope you're remembering to put your questions in the chat window. Here's a little bit of data of one of those such studies. These are data from the Andrews Forest, and on the x-axis, we are seeing the flow as a percent of the pre-treatment relationship. So numbers above 100 mean increases, 200 means a doubling, 300 means a tripling, and time is on the y-axis. And these two vertical dashed lines are the treatment period when the logging occurred. So here's the relationship of flows at the treated watershed to the reference watershed during the pre-treatment period. And here's the logging period. And then you get this increase. The whole collection of flows moves upward, and some of them are increased very greatly, some types of flows. And then that increase persists 40 years or more after the cutting, because after 40 years, the forest that's present is still only a tenth of the age of the forest that was removed. Another thing that forest harvest or forestry practices do is that the contemporary logging practices since World War II have involved the construction of forest roads to provide access for trucks to remove the logs. And the construction of roads themselves has many consequences, both for landsliding and for flooding. The oversteepening of the cut slope of the road can cause instability. The oversteepening of the fill slope can cause instability, and various other features of road drainage can speed the rate at which water moves into streams. So these factors can increase the delivery of both water and sediment into streams. And in the old days, in the 1970s in the Coast Range, sites like this were not uncommon. This is Knowles Creek in the 1970s, and the site had been clear cut and burned, as was the practice at that time. But we were looking upstream, and Dan, can you see my pointer wiggling around? Yeah, okay. So, and then what happened is that there was a debris slide on a slope up here in the watershed, and it came down into the stream and became a debris flow and scoured out the stream to bedrock, which is why it's shiny up here, and then made this big deposit of sediment at the junction of Knowles Creek with another stream. Here's another example also from the 1970s of an area which was affected by a debris flow, and the shiny bedrock shows how thick the flow was as it was moving downstream. These kinds of events were very common in the aftermath of logging and road building on steep slopes in the Coast Range. So here's a little diagram that shows all the different kinds of effects that roads can have, especially when they interact with clear cuts, because clear cuts increase soil moisture. Soil moisture makes soils both heavier and less cohesive, so they're more likely to produce mass movement successes or mass failures. And so there are really two sets of processes. One set is processes that affect water movement. Many of our roads typically are designed this way, where there's a hill slope, and then there's a hill slope cut to make the road flat, and a roadside ditch on the inboard side of the road, and then a road surface, and then a fill slope. And both of these are over steepened. That is, they're steeper than the slope of the hill, which has been adjusted over millennia of weathering and erosion. And so You can get a variety of different types of mass movement, including hill slope, slides, and debris flows, and slides off of the cut slope, which is like the photo that I showed you before. Sometimes the fill slope fails. Sometimes you'll just see cracks on the road, indicating that the road is slumping. And then there are also different phenomena that are related to the movement of water. These roads are constructed with inboard ditches, which are designed to keep the water off the road surface to enable the trucks to travel safely and automobiles. And the water is routed along the inboard ditch, typically to ditch relief or stream crossing culverts. But if there's a fair amount of sediment moving, the culverts can get plugged, and then the water can run along the surface of the road and etch a gully, or it can incise the ditch. So there's various factors that can occur. And that's thinking about roads at the scale of like a road segment of 100 yards or 200 yards. Now, if we back out and think about the effects of roads and how they interact with streams at the scale of a whole landscape, we can see how these effects can propagate through a whole stream drainage network. So in the lower left corner of these two diagrams, we've drawn a stream network in solid lines and a road network in dashed lines. And then we've shown 4 different cases. So moving from left to right, we increase the drainage density. We add more segments to stream networks, which is typical of the Coast Range, where the stream drainage networks are very dense. And then moving up in this, we increase the road density and we add more road segments. And what you can see is that if you look at the diagram in the lower left, in these little orange circles represent places where roads cross streams. And these are places where the action happens, because these are places where water is routed to streams or where sediment may be routed to streams. And you can see that moving from the lower left to the upper right, a larger and larger portion of the watershed is affected by the acceleration of water movement associated with roads. So there's a bigger and bigger effect potentially on peak flows. And in the right-hand diagram, these darkish black worms show stream segments that may be affected by debris flows. And you can see that the more road stream crossings, roughly speaking, the more of the stream network could potentially be affected by debris flows. I'll also mention in passing, which is another fun topic for other discussion, is road stream crossings are also a great place for non-native plants, which are introduced along roads to get washed into streams and then move down and infect the whole stream network. So, as you all know, I mean, the rules are continually changing through efforts of people such as yourselves to moderate the effects of undesirable forest practices on the land. And we want to be careful in our minds to separate what's happening on the federal lands, the national forests, and versus state and private lands, because they operate under different sets of rules. The federal lands have had a period, the national forests were not logged until after World War II, for the most part. Not from the early 20th century until World War II, they were not logged. But then there was a period of road building and patch clear cutting of old growth from just after World War II until 1990, when the spotted owl injunction led to the cessation of clear cutting of old growth forests, and no new roads have been built for the most part. And currently, harvesting is limited to thinning in plantations, which were established in this window of clear cutting. And I put this in parentheses. I don't actually know what's going to happen on the national forest. Maybe some of you do, as a result of the fires. So here you can see this sort of pattern in the example of 2 watersheds, the lower of which is coincident with the Andrews experimental forest. You can see that until the 1960s, we weren't seeing patch clear cutting in the watershed, but then there was a proliferation of the road network and patches of clear cutting up until 1990, when the Stall injunction essentially went into effect and changed things. On state and private land, the situation is a little bit different. These places are regulated by the Oregon Forest Practices Rules, which regulate things like how roads are designed, where they can be placed, particularly how close to streams they can be placed. Most of the roads in the Coast Range are now, or many of them are done along ridge tops, which is different than the Cascades. There are also limits on the size of individual clear cuts and how close they can be to one another within a certain time period. And particularly for our purposes, there is this requirement that streamside trees be left in streams of certain sizes. That these are the riparian buffers, as well as in some steep headwaters, and that replanting must occur within 2 years in order to accelerate the recapturing of the site by forest. So here's a picture, a couple pictures taken in March from the LC, the Paired Watershed Experiment, but looking across at the countryside. So this is, you know, a modern private and state forest landscape. You can see that here's a recent clear cut. You can see that it's been replanted with little trees. And you can also see the stems of the even-aged planted forest that had been on this site that was cut. And you can see in the distance some other clear cuts that are separated from one another. And then in the foreground, you can see the riparian buffer, which was retained in this site. And notably, what's important about this is that the riparian buffer contains trees, Douglas fir trees, that were planted in the previous rotation. In other words, at some time in history, this site was a mature and old forest. And prior to this current set of rules, the whole thing was logged with no buffers. And then the whole thing was planted with Douglas fir. And now that the riparian rules are in place, these trees can't be cut by law, so they stay. This is another view. You can see the steepness of the slopes, and you can see that logging may occur in parts of a watershed at different time periods. Here's a forest that's only a few years old. Here's the riparian buffer, and then these are some fresh clear cuts. And then here is a picture that shows that the riparian buffers, the stream buffers, the rules require that they be maintained in streams of a particular size. So here in the background, we have some zero order or first order basins, which may have running water in them that might be considered to be streams at some times of the year, but they don't have retained riparian forest. So the question is, what happens to water under these kinds of circumstances? So there are two sets of effects. The first is, we had a landscape with mature and old forests. It was being periodically burned, of course, but when forestry entered the landscape, the mature and old forest was logged and the landscape was replanted with forests, which they then may reach 40 or 50 years before they are logged. And so the question is, what happens to water during that time period of between when the mature and old forest was cut and when the replaced planted forest reaches 40 or 50 years? So initially, what happens is that the flow increases, as I mentioned before, and that happens even for summer flow. But when the plantations get to be 10 years old or 15 years old, the summer flow declines to levels lower than those from the reference watersheds, which still have mature and old forest. And this, what we are calling a summer water deficit, means that the flow coming out of plantations that are 25 to 45 or 50 years old in the summertime, July to September, maybe only half of that which is being provided from an adjacent catchment that contains mature and old forest. And another thing to keep in mind, and so in other words, if you look at a landscape that contains 25 to 40-year-old plantations, they are both using less water in the wintertime, so contributing to higher floods, but they're also using more water in the summertime, so lower summer flows compared to what would happen in mature or old forest. And here's a data slide that shows this. On the y-axis, we see the percent difference in the young forest or regenerating forest compared to mature and old forest. And so numbers greater than 0 indicate an increase in summer stream flow. This is July to September flow, or June to September. I can't actually see that because July to September. And so you can see that in the first couple years after logging, clear cutting, summer flow increases, but pretty soon the young trees and the shrubs regenerating on the site begin to use water, especially in the summertime, and the flows get pulled down to levels below that of the reference mature and old growth forest, and that in this time period of 25 to 45 years, the reductions may be half or more. So a second question that we're interested in is, okay, what happens when those 40-year-old plantations are harvested? One prediction might be, oh, well, we'll get that summer water surplus back again because that's what happened when we cut mature and old forest. But in fact, that isn't what happens. What happens is that now when the 40-year-old forests are harvested and the streamside buffer is left, what we observe is that the summer stream flow remains low. It increases a little bit, but it still remains lower than in the reference watershed. And by the time the replanted forest is only a few years old, as shown in that picture that I just showed you, the summer stream flow deficits are just as big as they were from the whole 40-year-old plantation. And furthermore, the summer deficits or the flows can be especially low in summers which are dry, and we're getting more of them because of climate change. So here's the data slide to support that. On the left-hand picture, we're again looking at the percent change of stream flow in a given watershed of a particular set of ages. These are 40 to 50-year-old forest plantations relative to mature and old forest. And the x-axis is the day of the water year. So this red line, which represents the Alsea basins that are in the Coast Range, indicates that these 40 to 50-year-old forests were providing 50% less water in October and even in November, and from May through September, relative to mature and old forests. And that compares to, in the Enders forest, which is shown by the green line, maybe because we have snow or it's higher elevation, generally cooler, we have these deficits, but they're restricted to a narrower part of the year. And then the pinkish line is the South Umpqua experimental forest. And there you can see that the streamflow deficits under the 40-year-old plantation are also occurring throughout much of the year. And then over on the right, we're just looking at the LC experiment. And what you can see is that again, we're showing the change of stream flow in the treated watershed. This is young forest as a function of day of year relative to the mature and old forest. So positive numbers means it's higher, negative numbers means it's lower. And what you can see from this pink line is that even in the first 5 years after that 40-year-old plantation was cut, with the riparian buffer, the summer stream flow deficits persisted, and they got more intense in the next few years when the forest was only 5 to 8 years old. So again, here we are now, we're looking at the site. This is the place that we're talking about. So this landscape is producing the same amount of stream flow in the summer as it would if it were covered with a 40-year-old plantation. And that's about half as much water as is being produced by the nearby catchment, Flynn Creek, which is in mature and old forest. So why is that happening? Well, I'm not really sure, but I think it probably has to do with the fact that trees that are growing rapidly, which is the intention when you're farming trees as a crop, are limited by water availability in our dry summers. But look what's happened to these trees. Let's see if I can get my pointer to work again. So these were all part of a stand that was competing for light. And so these trees lost all their lower branches because they were part of a dense stand. But now that the logging has happened, they're exposed to more wind and to more light. And I suspect that, but they're not limited by moisture because they're right along the stream. So there's all that water. So my expectation is that these trees have the capacity, as strange as that might seem to you, to use as much water, almost as much water, when they have abundant light and a lot of wind, as the whole watershed was using just in the summer. It would never happen in the winter. And there is also some water use happening by the replanted forest. So in conclusion, I went way longer than I said I was going to, Dan. But anyway, in conclusion, these long-term studies show that unmanaged, mature and old growth forests regulate floods more and release more water to stream flow during dry periods compared to managed forestry plantations. I will also mention that, of course, they store a huge amount of carbon, both in live and dead and down wood, and obviously have a lot of biodiversity. At the same time as we have these a century or so of Euro-American changes, transformation in our landscape, and 70 or 100 years of active forestry, particularly in the last 70 years, we're getting a warming climate, and that is in our part of the world is manifest by warmer summer days, especially the daytime maximum temperature, and less rain. And this is accentuating the stress on trees. So these findings have many implications, which I hope we will discuss. And I'd just like to thank the United States Forest Service, the National Science Foundation, and funding sources in Chile, where I've done some of this kind of work. And here are some of the sources that I referred to. So at that point, I will pass it back to you, Dan.
All right, thanks so much. That was wonderful, very informative. So we're gonna start the Q&A session here. I know questions will still be rolling in, but I'm gonna backtrack to the most recent questions. And the first question I actually got pretty early today, so before the presentation started. And this one is from Linda Tarr from the Port Orford Watershed Council. And she asks, My question is, are there GIS models for estimating the decrease in water supply in late summer, as well as the increase in sedimentation during storm events for a coastal watershed? This quantitative spatiality-based information would be useful in advocating for proactive timberland acquisition.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Models are based on relationships that are observed in nature or from experimentation that are expressed as equations and extrapolated over a landscape. So a person could, and this has been done, I think, in some instances. For example, the Bureau of Land Management has made some efforts to try to extrapolate findings from paired watershed experiments to broader landscapes. So I think that it could be done, but I don't know of any existing models that do it. Does that make sense?
Okay, so next question is from Alex Harris. Segura et al. 2020 and Perry and Jones 2016 both found industrial logging practices, i.e. plantations, can lead to a 50% reduction in summer stream flows when compared to adjacent mature forest. How applicable are these results to Washington's low elevation west side forests? How can Velma modeling be used to ascertain the hydrologic impacts of forest practices in specific watersheds in the Pacific Northwest?
Well, that's a great second question to follow up after the first one. So I should have said in response to the first one that there are efforts to extend these findings through mechanistic hydrologic models that are also spatial. And Bob McCain and the Velma model is the most pertinent effort that I know of. So the answer is that, as I understand it, Bob is actually working on this topic and working on it in conjunction with some of you, though I don't know exactly who, because he has told me that he has been working to implement the findings from these paired watershed studies and demonstrate how they might be extrapolated to landscapes in the Coast Range.
That's great. Okay, Francis Etherington writes, why did most of the Coast Range forests burn 500 years ago?
Ooh, what a great question. Well, I don't personally work on fire history, but I work closely with people who have done so since the 1970s. And it always seemed to me to be unimaginable. Well, it's very difficult to find a tree of any species that's more than 500 years old in the Pacific Northwest. There are a few places with super old growth trees that are 600 or maybe even 800 years old, but I could not imagine events that could burn down every tree except a few in the whole region until Labor Day of this year. And on Labor Day, we saw, especially those of us who are in the Willamette Valley, we experienced the kind of events that must have occurred 500 years ago, which is a very unusual, extremely high pressure ridge on the interior of the east side, which produced extremely high winds at a time of year when there were little fires that had been initiated, especially on the east side of the Cascades, by lightning strikes. But the wind blew those fires up and created, well, I wouldn't really call the fires of September firestorms, but there must have been events of that type. The Tillamook burns, which occurred in the Coast Range in the 1930s, it was reported that those events had enough energy that the energy of the winds generated by the fire was capable of lifting old growth logs in flames and carrying them out to sea. So I guess, we live in a world which is shaped by catastrophic events, and we don't see them very often, but we get little hints. And so I think the fires of September are a hint of what might have happened on multiple occasions around 1500.
Yeah, I know the fires in the late 1840s removed about 33% of the Coast Range, which is quite significant. Okay, so we have Kristen Koptuich. So if it is widely recognized by surrounding states and pretty much all environmentalists, why can't Oregon increase the distance between clear cuts and pesticide spraying and streams to be at least comparable to neighboring states?
There's another person in this audience who probably could answer that question better than I could. A former OSU student, Stacy Detweiler, who has been working for Rogue River Keepers, studied for her master's degree at Oregon State University, questions about road rules, where she essentially posed the same question: why do Washington and California have stronger environmental protections than Oregon? And the answer isn't a science question. I think it's a political question. Oregon has been a very lucrative place for timber production, and the balance of power that prevails in California and Washington is different than in Oregon.
That's true. Paul Engelmeyer writes, can you speak about fog drip changes in old growth forests and plantations?
Ooh, well, I could speak, but can I say anything sensible? It seems clear that forests capture fog because it condenses on canopies, and especially coastal forests like the redwoods have higher precipitation than they would otherwise because of the condensation of the fog on the foliage. The trees act essentially as fog catchers, and then that fog becomes throughfall or precipitation. So there's no doubt that effect occurs. But what I can't answer, and so if you remove the trees altogether, I think there's pretty convincing evidence from the redwood areas that precipitation goes down when you take the trees away, because the under certain times of year, because the water that the former trees were using was less than the amount that they were adding by fog or cloud water interception. What I can't answer is I don't know what is the capacity of a planted forest to do fog or cloud interception. I don't know of any studies that have looked at that, and I think there's much less work on that topic here in Oregon than there is in the redwoods. But it's a great question.
Okay, Caleb Mentzer asks, what is the best tool to assess forest road sediment delivery? GRAIP. What do you recommend for a riparian buffer?
See, there are two questions. Tool for assessing road sediment delivery. Well, I know that there has been a lot of work. That road hydrology work that I described to you was published, or it began to come out almost 25 years ago. And I understand that it led to a great many efforts to develop assessment methods to determine which road segments might be most susceptible to road hydrology or road effects on landsliding. But I don't know anything about the tools themselves. I will say, though, that I think that walking the roads and observing is a very good way to get a sense of how roads are functioning, because if you look at the ditches and you look at the road surface and you look for evidence of landslides and sediment movement and plugged culverts, you can learn a huge amount and do it in a few hours just walking along the roads. So that's something I enjoy doing. The other question was, what about riparian buffers? So this is really an interesting quandary because, you know, the riparian buffers were created for environmental protections. You know, the riparian buffers provide shade and keep water cool, which is important for fish habitat and for the temperature, not just in the stream that has the buffer, but for all the rest of the stream network downstream where that is receiving that water. And so on the other hand, especially when the trees that are retained in the buffer are plantation trees that may have been bred to grow fast, those trees will continue to use water, as this research shows, and so there'll be less water. So these are two counteracting consequences of buffers. And it remains, I think, a matter of considerable discussion how the buffers ought to be managed, not how wide they are, but what should they contain. And to elaborate on this, I will say that this is a very big issue also in South America, where plantations of non-native species of eucalyptus and Pinus radiata, which is native to California, were established in the 1970s. And then in the 1990s, the Chilean government established an actually much more generous riparian buffer rule. But now what's happened is that the private industry can't cut the trees within the riparian buffer. And so there are all these eucalyptus trees and pines that are still in the buffers, and they keep on using water. So the communities in the coastal range of Chile, which depend for their water sources on the streams, still have declining flows, even though the industry is meeting the environmental regulations. So I think it's a very challenging question about what ought to be done and how those buffers ought to be managed. And it's a really good challenge for more science, more experimentation. There is an experiment in the South Umpqua Experimental Forest where I believe there will be an experiment to do some thinning of the planted Douglas fir within a riparian buffer zone that is a federal buffer zone width. And the idea is to see whether the beneficial effects of the riparian zone on stream temperature and aquatic habitat can be maintained while also mitigating the stream water decreases. And then there's also the carbon story, you know, which is a whole other angle on all of this.
Yeah. Okay, this kind of segues. We have Randy Henry asking, do beaver populations reflect the changes described?
Boy, I don't know anything about beavers, but I do think it's a really important, I mean, I don't know about the status of beavers in the Coast Range. I do think, though, that the principle behind the efforts to reintroduce beavers and to promote beaver survival is that beavers can create ponds and other structures which can retain water and promote infiltration of water into the groundwater and delay water movement off the landscape. And so they are, you know, ecosystem engineers and could be desirable from that point of view.
Okay, Alice Yeats asks, during that 40-year period post-logging, where there are continued influences on hydrology, have people looked at forest conditions during that regrowth time? For example, variable density thinning prescriptions versus dense, even-aged regrowth.
Oh, that's an excellent question. I mean, I don't know what is being considered by the forest industry in Oregon. I do know um, through my work in Chile that the forestry companies there are considering alternative densities of planting of trees and other forestry treatments, because the forest industry in Chile has really been pilloried by very broad national opposition to forest practices, which has forced them to re-examine how they manage. So the principle behind the question is a very good one. To what extent are the summer low flow deficits that we are observing in Oregon, to what extent are they attributable to the very high density with which commercial tree plantations are managed? Would a lower density of trees not have such an effect? I think that's a really excellent question, and one that might be amenable to experimentation and ought to be advocated for.
Okay, Caleb Menser asks, do your models take into account summer water withdrawals for permitted agriculture or non-permitted use?
That's a great question. The studies that I am citing are in unregulated watersheds, so they do not have water withdrawals. But of course, water withdrawals would exacerbate these problems. And so they are a fact. If you live on if you get your water from a stream and you have upstream riparian people who have water rights, then the water that is flowing past your house is a function not only of what's happening in the forest, but also what is being withdrawn both by wells and by surface water withdrawals from anybody upstream of you. And this makes it challenging to have community discussions about conservation. Um, I had a student who did a really interesting project in southeast Washington, in Walla Walla, where there's a creek that drains out of a national forest, but then it goes past a number of residences before it reaches an area where it's habitat for endangered salmonids. And but it's an agricultural area, so there's a lot of groundwater withdrawals for irrigation. And so it's quite challenging to identify, is it the forest management or is it the riparian, is it the homeowners along the creek, or is it the agricultural water users who are tapping into these deep groundwater wells? Who's contributing to the decline in flow? The fish don't know what the difference is. They just know they don't have the habitat. But for people to come together and try to come up with a solution, this area actually is a test bed, a sort of a model community in the state of Washington for trying to figure out those problems.
Okay, we have a bigger picture question here from Andrew Orahoski. He asks, why are we still clear cutting our forests? Less water and more extreme fire danger sounds like a public health crisis.
Yeah, I don't get to make those decisions, but I think that at least in the Cascade Range, in the area around the Andrews Forest, forests are managed on a clear-cut rotation for many reasons that primarily have to do with the growth habits of Douglas fir and the economics of forest practices. There is also the additional factor, which is another change in the last couple of decades, which is that the large vertically integrated forest companies like Weyerhaeuser and Georgia Pacific, who used to own the land, own the trees, own the mills, and make all of those decisions in an integrated fashion. Many of those have sold their land to real estate investment trusts and TMOs, timber management organizations, where the clear-cutting decisions are based on changes in a stock market and have nothing to do with forest management principles. So it's really a challenging situation for Oregon, I think, to try to even to find who to talk to about those issues.
Indeed. Okay, Yves Mayrand asks, are there similar water flow studies available for partial or selective cutting watershed areas compared to clear-cut watersheds?
Great question. Yes, some of these long-term paired watershed experiments included either small patch clear cuts where only part of the watershed was cut, or in other cases, some kind of like a shelter wood cut where they thinned the trees and left them. So in the former case, in cases where there are small patches, smaller clear cuts within the watershed, and those where those were replanted with Douglas fir, we see hints of summer stream flow deficits emerging that are roughly proportional to the fraction of the area of the watershed that is treated in that way. On the other hand, when in the cases, in the one case, which is a basin in the South Umpqua experimental forest, there was one example where there was a shelter wood cut, which took out about half of the tree basal area, about half of the wood in 1970. And then they were going to come back, but they never got around to coming back for the rest of the trees. And in that case, there is very little detectable effect on stream flow. So it appears from that one example that selective thinning of older forests may, which is not dissimilar to the kinds of processes which we infer may have occurred under some natural fire regimes, has relatively little effect either in producing big floods or in producing stream flow deficits. So it's a great question.
That's very interesting. Okay, so Chris Milan writes, aside from stream flows, what about water infiltration? Some remain in under and top soils and some migrate down into water tables.
Right, yeah. I mean, so in the winter time when we get our winter rains, the water that arrives on the surface of the soil is more than can be taken up and evapotranspired by trees. And so that it percolates further down into the soil and restores the groundwater. So, you know, Dan commented in his introduction that the former owner of the property that he lives on believed that he was seeing some relationship or some response of the spring. So the spring is groundwater coming out of the ground. That there was some relationship between the spring and the way the forests had been managed nearby. And in the case of this long-term, which are about now 12-year-long studies that I've worked with in Chile, the combination of intensive forestry with non-native species like eucalyptus and a mega drought that occurred for much of the 2010s has led to a depletion of groundwater. So it is literally drying up springs in those places. And the question then becomes, in the case of Chile and potentially here, how long would it take if you change the forest management practice? How long would it take to restore or replenish the groundwater resource to bring back those springs to their former function? And with climate change, will that ever happen? It's an open question, but a very interesting and important one, like some of the other questions that have been asked here, where there ought to be research done on this topic in places that call themselves, research forests.
Yeah. Okay, we have Stacy Detweiler. Hi, Julia, and thanks for this presentation. What types of impacts, if any, do you think that reducing or eliminating hydrologic connectivity of forest roads would have on summer stream flow?
Ooh, great question, Stacy. Nice to hear your written question. So Stacy's question is a really good one. The notion is that forest roads, one of their effects is that because they're cut into the hill slope, they sap water out of the deep soil and convert it into surface flow, which then goes to streams, especially during storms. So forest roads can, under certain circumstances, not always, have the effect of sort of sapping, removing the deep soil water. And so Stacy's question is, well, what if you did some kind of road restoration treatment where you removed that effect? What would be the consequence? And Stacy, I don't really know the answer, but the principle that you raise is a really good one. And it seems to me like, the most effective way to restore the deep soil water is a complete road pullback. But as you know, those are the most expensive ones. And I don't know much about the numbers, except that I know that there was some experimentation done in Redwood National Park, and it was like $1 million for a mile of road. So water bars and other water retention structures, decommissioning roads and letting the trees grow on the road surface, those all seem like worthy things to do that may be less expensive and less engineering intensive. So I guess the answer would be anything could help if, as long as you can get permission from the community that the road doesn't actually need to be used anymore.
Okay, we have Laura Baker. Have you looked at the effect of albedo in terms of warmer, drier soils of clear cuts?
I have not, but certainly the reflectivity of a surface is one of many factors that contributes to the heat, the heating of that surface, which then affects how much evaporation occurs. There have been a lot of arguments over the years about the role of albedo in the energy budget. So I think it's an interesting point, but I don't have anything worth saying about it. I guess I'll just say that.
Okay, Janice Reed asks, what are the common arguments that you have heard that attempt to counter your research findings, and what has been your response to those arguments?
Ooh, oh, that's such a great question. Well, the typical attack is that paired watershed experiments aren't relevant to today's forestry. And so I mentioned early in my talk that some of the paired watershed experiments were done using clear cutting of old growth and broadcast burning. And so people argue that, oh, well, because we don't do that anymore, those experiments aren't relevant. We shouldn't pay any attention to them. Well, except that they are relevant because we're living in a landscape that is the result of those practices. So they are relevant. Another argument is, oh, well, those are small watershed. It's just the headwaters of the catchments. And so that doesn't have any effect on, the big rivers, except that, well, they do, because the headwaters provide the water for the big rivers. And in separate work, which I didn't present tonight, many people, not just myself, are finding that there are long-term decreases in inflows to reservoirs throughout the Columbia River Basin and other parts of this country. And some of those may well be attributable to the legacies of forest changes. They are not, some of them may be due to climate change and others may be due to land use change. And another common counter is, oh, it's only the small peak flows that are affected. It's not the big ones. But that's not correct, because the big flows are affected. It's interesting. It's really interesting because there was a lot of pushback to the work that I did about 25 years ago that was about floods. And I think I was going to show in my talk, there's a sort of a spoof version of the hydrologic cycle, and it goes floods, goes to concern, goes to drought, goes to apathy. And I think that's actually a very good diagram of the hydrologic cycle, because it does seem like people do get a lot more agitated about floods than they do about drought or water deficits, but we're probably equally affected by water deficits. Maybe it's because they come on us slowly or they're harder to perceive. I don't know why.
Okay, Brian Duggan asks, water quality improvement strategies do include reducing human consumption, but also should advocate for late successional reserve protections and enhancements. How do we make this a priority instead of a potential radical idea?
Oh, wow. You're just asking a scientist that question. What am I supposed to know? I mean, I think you guys are the answer to that question. Look at your groups. I mean, you're incredibly active and influential, and you're raising people's awareness. As an educator, I would simply say, I think it is important for everyone to understand where our water comes from and why it has the water quality that it has, and the role of forests in that. And so just helping our neighbors and friends and children and aunts and uncles understand that will be a help. And activists, citizen groups, public interest groups, such as the ones hosting this talk, are incredibly important in that that effort. So, my hat's off to you guys.
Okay, we have about maybe 10 minutes left of questions. So I am going to mainly look at things that revolve around your science and not necessarily activism, but we'll see what we can get through here. Before I go on, there have been a few requests for your slides. So if you're willing to share that, we'll talk about that and maybe try to get those to people. And then there was also the references slide, if you can show that after we're done here. So some people could take another look at that.
I will be very happy to provide my talk, which includes the reference slide, to you, Dan, and you can distribute it in any way you like. It's all published material, so.
Okay, perfect, thank you. Okay, so we have Ryan Farrell. Are replanted forests typically planted at a higher stem densities than a naturally selected old growth forest?
I don't know for a fact, but I believe that to be the case. I think if you look, there are very few examples that are permitted to regenerate after a disturbance. Mount St. Helens National Monument might be a good place to look. Thanks for the thumbs up. You know, but generally when there's a fire or any other kind of forestry operation, the goal seems to be to plant the trees as densely as possible and to recapture the site as fast as possible. So yeah, the density of stems, I suspect, the density of trees does have something to do with this effect on stream flow, for sure.
There we go. It sounds like, Paul Ingermeyer writes, it sounds like when a stream that is on the 303D list for temperature, almost all of our streams, industrial logging may appear to keep the stream lower in summer and prevent the stream from staying cold twofold. Inadequate buffers and inadequate water flows. I'm actually not sure if that's a question or just a
Yeah.
comment on something.
I think I will say that I'll just reiterate that this is a quandary because the buffers do shade the streams and therefore they keep the water cool, but at the same time they appear to be using water and reducing flow. So it looks like, you know, so what do you do? If you reduce the buffer width, are you going to get more stream warming and just be back to where you were before? What is an intermediate solution that retains the shading and cooling properties of a riparian buffer, but reduces its water use? And one approach would be to selectively remove the plantation trees that are left over from the pre-buffer era and retain the native trees in the buffer zone that may perhaps not use so much water. But that's just a conjecture, and it's largely based from work in Chile, and I don't know. And there, as I said, this experiment in the South Umpqua experimental forest, which will be conducted by the Forest Service, is the first experiment of its type to try to do that and experiment with what would happen.
Okay, Alexander Harris writes, would you say that the watersheds studied in the Andrews and Elsie forests can be considered representative of hemlock Doug fir forests in Western Washington?
I would say that in the absence of long-term paired watershed studies in Western Washington, they represent a first approximation. I will also say that similar findings are emerging to what is in the Perry and Jones and Segura papers from studies in British Columbia, further to the north. So it appears that this effect is not unique to Oregon.
All right, we're gonna do maybe two more questions here. Trigvi Steen writes, when stands are opened up, it would appear that evapotranspiration increases, perhaps from more airflow?
Yes. Yes, more wind. Yep, for sure.
Okay, Peter Hayes writes, to what degree is the research you are doing linked to related research related to plantation silviculture done with OSU's College of Forestry? Is there room for greater coordination and integration?
Certainly, there is room for greater coordination and integration. My faculty appointment is in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University. I have an adjunct appointment in the College of Forestry, and I interact with people on the faculty there. And there is a silviculturalist from the College of Forestry who is participating in the design of the experiment, Klaus Putman, who's participating in the design of the experiment I was talking about, for example, to test how we might manage riparian buffers to try to get both shade and cooling and not too much water use by the trees. But I think there's a lot of potential for the College of Forestry to engage in continued work on these kinds of topics. Catalina Segura is in the College of Forestry. And so there are some, definitely a lot of talent there, for sure.
Okay, I'm gonna ask just one more because this is kind of related to the last question. Brian Duggan writes, Julia, are you aware of the efforts to address the management of the Elliott State Forest? If so, what are your recommendations for either management of or suggested future paired watershed studies there?
So I have looked at the plan for the Elliott Forest. I am not part of the drafting of the plan at all. I think that there are many opportunities. If that forest becomes managed by Oregon State University, there are many opportunities for studies to be done there of this type. But I do not see evidence that such studies are yet being planned in the plan that is currently, or was until Sunday, open for comment. I think this is an important arena in which public interest groups could have a beneficial effect, and that is to ask for research on topics that are of concern and which of concern to you and your communities related to water provision and water quality and roads and forestry treatments, because it's not clear to me what they're thinking about that. It's unclear what they're thinking.
Yeah. Well, there is just a lot of gratitude in the comment chat section there for you, Julia. We really are super grateful that you took the time out and talk to us about your work. It's really good stuff.
It's my pleasure. It's people like you in the audience who make change happen, and I really admire all of your work, and I was honored to be able to talk to you tonight. So if there are additional questions that arose in the chat window that I didn't have an opportunity to answer, Dan, you can certainly, I guess one of you will get the chat window when the meeting ends. I'd be happy to answer them in written form and send them back to you. And I will share my slides, and I'm open to further communication or further discussion about detailed topics from these publications or others, as you wish.
Thank you, Julia. I just wanted to reiterate, I put this in the chat, but anybody who wants the slides or a copy of the recording, please send an email to coastrangeforestwatch@gmail.com, and we can make sure that that gets to you. So thank you all for joining.
All right, well, that will conclude this evening. Appreciate y'all coming, and have a great night and rest of your week.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.